Well, I think raising anyone from the dead is a good place to begin. That would evoke surprise and kind of pay attention. People would start gathering around. I think at a deeper level, though, it's also a widow who would have been on the margins of society. Widows, orphans, the poor, they were people who are not to be taken seriously. And so here you have a woman and a widow being taken seriously by a person of some power and influence. And then engaging in a healing act. Now, healers were all over the place. Successful healers, perhaps less so. And I think it's all those elements coming together, and the depth of the relationship and the compassion. One of the things that I think is striking in the Gospels is the ways in which Jesus connects with people. It's not just that he does stuff or says stuff. There's a kind of relational depth, a compassion, an empathy that I think is really powerful, and it's somewhat surprising to see. God is full of surprises, and sometimes I think, one of those surprises is that God would continue to love me in spite of everything I've done in my life. Now, I've not done the most horrific things, but I've done some things that I really regret. And, it's like it's sometimes been attributed to Groucho Marx or Woody Allen. He said he wouldn't want to join any country club that would have him as a member. Sometimes we're not sure we want to believe in a God who would forgive me or forgive the Ninevites in Jonah's story. And yet God just continues to say, I love you. And I'm going to do things for you, not because of your faith, not because I think you're terrific. The end of the story of Jonah, reveals that God forgives the Ninevites, and he doesn't think they're that bright. He says, they're a little better than animals, but they don't know their left hand from their right, and I still love them. And I think that's the power, is that God continues to surprise, that Christ in the Gospels regularly is interacting with people in ways that embraces them and loves them in ways that they're going, surely you didn't mean me. And that's the call throughout Scripture with lots of the prophets. God comes and says, I'm calling you. And the prophet says, I don't talk so good. Why? Surely there's somebody else. And it's that kind of power of God to make new. You think about the disciples on the road to Emmaus, or Mary on Sunday morning, on Easter Sunday. They were in the depths of despair. And that's when God comes and says, hey, you thought you pushed my son out of the world on the cross. I got news for you. 2 Corinthians 1 says that Jesus is God's definitive yes. And I just love that because, what we see regularly with Jesus and the way God works in surprising ways is us regularly saying no to God and to others. And God saying, yeah, I got a better response for you. It's called yes. At the congregational level or at the communal level, I was talking to a person who was talking about churches in North Carolina, in some rural areas, difficult areas, and some churches that were flourishing from churches that were dying. And we were talking, and somebody else in the room said, well, how would you distinguish those churches that are flourishing from the ones that are dying? And the person said, well, the ones that are flourishing have God at the center, and the ones that are dying have themselves at the center. And my first thought was, well, that's a pretty simple distinction. The more I thought about it, the more I realized it got to the very heart of the matter. That if you think God's at the center of your life together, you're going to be surprised all the time. There's a great story of a church in eastern North Carolina that was declining, and so the people in the church started praying for children, for the next generation. Well, they got a whole bunch of children. They were Burmese refugees, Karen community. And so all of a sudden they realized they hadn't prayed for a specific type of children, they just prayed for children. And God sent them lots of children with very dark skin. And now that church is booming, and about 3/4 of the members of that church are from Burma. Because once they welcomed these people, then they started saying, others, come ahead. Well, that was people who prayed. And if you really pray for God to work miracles, The miracles are going to happen, but they're probably not going to happen in exactly the form that you requested. Oh yeah, being intentional, having the eyes to see, I think is really crucial. And to believe that God's at work in other people's lives in those ways is really powerful. And that's why, when I was talking about how Stephen Fowle translates Philippians 2, it's not just thinking and feeling and living. The word perceiving in there is about how do we see things? Dorothy Day used to say at the Catholic Worker, she wanted you to greet every stranger at the door as if it was Christ himself. I sure don't do that. If somebody comes to the door, I think, oh, geez, who is it? Being every other person, as Greg Boyle would put it, with that stance of awe. How's God at work in their life? Instead of a judgment, ooh, I wonder what's wrong with them. If we in American life or in a church had a habit of starting every meeting with, where'd you see the presence and power of God at work today? It might change the tone of our conversations, and it might seem less counterintuitive because, it might be a really surprising story that somebody tells in those ways. And I think that was a lot of what's sparked the imagination of the early church. Mary going to the disciples and saying, I've seen the Lord, I got a story to tell you. The disciples on the road to Emmaus, we thought we were hosting a meal, and then all of a sudden, it's the risen Christ. Who knew? When you tell those kinds of stories, amazing things start to happen. And I think that's part of what we need to recover is the good news storytelling that embraces that sense of, here's God at work. Yes, it is happening, and it's not happening enough in at least contemporary America. Whenever the gospel comes alive in people's lives, in a community's life, in a congregation's life, extraordinary things happen. And part of the power that Cavan is talking about with that new social imagination was the spread of the gospel. How did you go from 5,000 followers of Jesus in the year 50 to 5 million followers 2 centuries later, long before Constantine? And so what you see is the spread of institutions and the reshaping of people's lives where other people are going, I want to be part of that. That's who I want to be connected to. I mentioned Father Greg Boyle. Homeboy Industries would be an example of the surprising character of the gospel. People in Hollywood have been funding his work with gang kids because he sees how Father Boyle's programs are changing lives and transforming lives. He's been featured on 60 Minutes and invited to the White House in President George W. Bush's administration. We had him come to Duke, and I interviewed him, and if I had $1 for every undergraduate who said, oh, if that's what Christianity is, sign me up. Because they were surprised to see this gospel come to life. It happens in local communities, in programs and initiatives and transforming lives. And when I say, and it's not happening enough, we've settled into too much of a kind of acculturated establishment mindset where we're not thinking about where's God calling us to new life? Where's God calling us to create the new institutions of the future? What do we need to be doing in different ways to meet the needs, not of 1985, but of 2025? And what might God be calling us to do that's quite surprising and maybe even audacious in the ways that the early church expressed that in such powerful ways?